Appendix A. Origin of the Tweed Ring. Memorandum of Charles O'Connor. Court of Appeals. Stephen Clark v. R.U.S. the Mayor, etc., of New York. The history of this case is somewhat remarkable. It covers a period of important changes. It was tried 3 times, and the result of each trial was reviewed in the court of last resort. It was argued there 7 times. The judgments in the court of first instance were all for the plaintiffs. 2 of these judgments were reversed, and the last was, in a very singular, and as I think in a most irregular and unwarrantable way, affirmed in part, to the great injury of our city treasury. The case was commenced in 1843, whilst the Constitution of 1821 was in force. Of course, it was initiated under our original judicial system, and according to the ancient practice. During its pendency, the new judiciary of 1846 came into being, as also did at a late period AD 1848 the Code of Procedure. Its 3 journeys to the court of last resort occurred whilst that tribunal was organized according to the Constitution of 1846, and what may be deemed greater changes occurred during its pendency. The political party which almost from the beginning had controlled the general policy of the federal government passed out of power. When it commenced, not even 1 life had ever been taken for the crime of treason or been lost in a rebellious effort. Public debt was almost unknown, and the whole country was moving onward in a career of prosperity unparalleled in magnitude and promise by anything recorded in the history of mankind. Official malversation was rare, and was confined to isolated instances of individual criminality. Descending to detail as to a single department, it may be added that the interests of the American metropolis had always received in judicial controversies an honest and faithful advocacy. Between its commencement and its close there were changes of a social nature as well as in governmental policy and official habits. At the first mentioned period, frugality prevailed in private life. Considerable amounts were rarely involved in litigation. Moderate gains on each business operation satisfied desire. The acquisition of wealth was not dreamed of unless in some secret gambling saloon, save as the result of a long and laborious career of patient and sedulous effort. How little public jobs, greatly gainful to individuals, were even thought of, much less carried on as a disguise for rapine, might be happily illustrated by references to the most important and beneficial enterprises theretofore known, say the Erie Canal and the Croton Aqueduct. Of things precedent to and yet existing when this suit was commenced in 1843, let this view suffice. There is no need of showing in detailed contrast how mischievously, in every point adverted to, our condition was varied during the 20 years of its pendency, or how it stood at the termination in 1864. That contrast is open to all eyes. The case and its attendant circumstances might furnish materials for an illustrative page, if not a chapter, in his epic or his annals, should our decline derive sufficient interest from our consequent fall, to tempt in future times the genius of a poet or the pen of a historian. But a truce to moralizing. Let us proceed to the narrative. The plaintiffs had constructed the Croton Reservoir at 86th Street. In alleged conformity with the power reserved in the contract to alter the form, dimensions, or materials of the work, the defendant engineer had ordered a diminution in the depth of the reservoir. The plaintiffs disputed the propriety of this order, and claimed to recover as damages the difference between the contract prices of the excavation dispensed with by this order and the less sum which its performance would have cost. This claim may be stated in round numbers at $45,000. The first peculiar feature in the prosecution was laying the venue in Albany. It cannot fairly be assumed that there was any artifice in this. It is believed that no similar claim against the city had ever previously been tried elsewhere than in the city, but the eminent law firm, Reynolds and Benedict, who were the plaintiffs' attorneys, resided in Albany, and of course, as any attorneys would have done, They consulted their own convenience in naming the place of trial, and the law department of the city of New York did not move to change it, but, as to this point, went unresistingly to trial before referees in Albany. According to what is believed to be the universal referee system in suits against the city of New York, the plaintiffs recovered. On appeal to the general term, Harris, J., of Albany, gave an opinion in favor of the plaintiffs on the merits. With him concurred a member of the bench, who was subsequently removed by the legislature for incapacity. Honorable Seward Bigelow filed a strongly expressed dissent. See Clark v. Mayer, 3rd Barb. This judgment was reversed in the Court of Appeals. No question affecting the merits was then brought before the Court of Appeals. The reversal went upon a technical point, which need not be further attended to. It never again arose. New referees were appointed in May 1851, and Charles O'Connor was retained by the City Law Department to conduct the defense. He had entire charge of the case thenceforth, to its close, in 1846. The eminent senior of the law firm before mentioned gave place to, or was now supplemented by, the late Nicholas Hill, Jr. Thence until May 1, 1859, when he died, Mr. Hill was an active counsel in the case. He argued it before the referees and in the Court of Appeals. On this, the second trial, the referees decided in precise conformity with the first decision, giving interest, however, in addition to the amount properly awarded. Interest had not been before claimed, exceptions having been taken by the city, and an appeal entered in its behalf, the Albany General Term in May 1885, held by Amasa J. Parker, William B. Wright, and Nera Harris, J.J., affirmed the judgment of the referees. Of course, this must almost inevitably have been the result in that district so long as the reported opinion of Harris, J., and his concurry above cited from Tweed Barber remained unreversed by the Court of Appeals. As to the principal sum involved, and as to the principles of law in controversy, it was a controlling precedent in that district. The city appealed to the Court of Appeals, and the case was twice there heard before the same judges in 1858. Judge Harris, whose opinion had been for the plaintiffs from the commencement, was an appeal judge for that year, and some division in the court prevented a judgment. But in 1859 it was again heard, and a judgment of reversal was pronounced which ought to have given the plaintiff's claim its quietus. The reporter's statement showed explicitly that 5 judges against 3, forming an absolute majority, had been for the city on the principal question. At the end of this statement will be found a copy of Judge Denio's conference minutes showing the same fact. The case was thereafter tried in the autumn of 1860, before Good, J., at the Albany Circuit. On this trial the case as to the principal stood thus. The opinion of Harris, J., and his companion, reported in 3rd Barber, P., was a conclusive precedent for the plaintiffs unless it had been reversed with the concurrence of 5 judges by the Court of Appeals, and if such a reversal had taken place then that judgment was conclusive against the plaintiffs. The plaintiffs' counsel, J. H. Reynolds, Esquire, and ex-Judge Harris, produced a letter from ex-Judge Cornelius L. Allen, who, as a Supreme Court Justice, had sat in the Court of Appeals in 1859, and was one of the 5 who voted for the reversal then pronounced. This letter was dated at Salem in Washington County, September 14, 1860. It stated that his vote was founded upon the allowance of interest, and that he neither expressed nor formed any opinion on the principle. If this was true, it showed that only 4 judges concurred in the opinion against the plaintiff's claim. Basing himself on this letter, Good, J., instructed the jury to find for the plaintiff's principle and interest, and they found accordingly. The judgment on this verdict was affirmed, of course, by the Albany General Term without any written opinion being delivered. The city appealed to the Court of Appeals, and on the 3rd argument of this latter appeal the judgment was affirmed as to the principle. There were many things about the course of this case to justify the satisfaction. I think the facility with which the state's central machinery and politics at Albany could be employed against the metropolitan city was first learned in this case. The case was commenced in a law office of which the head was the most prominent anti-democrat in Albany. From and after 1851 another law office was engaged on that side, i.e., that which had for its head the leading Democratic counselor there, and for its chief business manager the perpetual secretary of the Democratic State Committee. The Honorable Harris of Albany, who as soon as he descended from the bench appeared as counsel for the plaintiffs, gave the opinion of the plaintiffs on the first judicial hearing. That was an opinion, as we have seen, of a very lean majority, yet as an authority it was of conclusive force for the plaintiffs thenceforth to the very end. It controlled on the second and third trials and on both appeals to the general term, and it thereby placed the plaintiffs on such a vantage ground in the Court of Appeals that on the third and final appeal it might entitle the plaintiffs to an affirmance, though not even half of the judges in that court were in their favor. And in fact, as will be seen, it was made the basis of their substantial triumph, when at least 5 voices out of 7 entitled the city to a reversal. It is above stated that ex-Judge Cornelius L. Allen's letter was produced with fatal effect at the third trial. Thereupon the city's council went immediately to the Honorable Hiram Denio, who was in the Court of Appeals in 1859 and 1860. He stated that Judge C. L. Allen concurred with him, Denio, in the opinion against the plaintiffs on the principal question, and so expressed himself. Judge Denio's original minutes of the consultation show this fact clearly. When ex-Judge Cornelius L. Allen's letter was produced at the circuit and at the general term, the city's council asserted that the fact was otherwise, and desired an investigation to be had. He also claimed, which is plain enough, that the reporter's certificate confirmed his assertion. But the ex-judge was deemed a better witness than the official reporter. The city's appeal from this judgment came into the Court of Appeals in 1861. Only 7 judges ever sat in it. Davies, J., having been counsel for the city, deemed it proper not to take part. And the plaintiffs, by their counsel, John H. Reynolds, Esquire, moved, in 1861, to postpone the argument to the following year, because ex-Judge Harris, the plaintiff's counsel, being a senator in Congress, was detained on public service in Washington, and was therefore unable to attend. The city's council strenuously opposed the motion, but it was granted. Mr. Reynolds had before argued for the plaintiffs in that court, and he alone filled the office on all subsequent arguments. Judge Harris had appeared in the case, but he never argued it at the bar. The case on this third appeal was first argued in 1862. The plaintiffs did not bring forward the fatal letter or certificate of ex-Judge Cornelius L. Allen, although, as has been seen, they had twice previously used it, i.e., at the trial and at the general term, and they again used it on each of the 2 subsequent arguments in the Court of Appeals. At this argument, in 1862, S. L. Selden, H. Denio, W. R. Wright, J. Sutherland, G. Good, W. F. Allen, and E. Darwin Smith, J. J. presided, but they did not agree upon a judgment. In 1863 it was again heard, and 5 judges did not agree to any judgment. The final argument was heard in 1864, when Denio, Hogeboom, Mullen, and Ingraham, 4 judges, were for reversal as to the principal, and H. R. Selden, J., for reversal as to the interest. Doubtless W. B. Wright and T. A. Johnson, J. J., were for affirmance. 5 of the 7 judges who voted were for reversal, and of course the judgment should have been reversal. If they could not concur as to the grounds of reversal, no consequence could legitimately result from their failure except that it would prevent the decision from being a precedent. But without a color of right or authority, a compromise judgment of partial affirmance was entered corresponding to the conclusion of H. R. Selden's opinion. We have seen, first, that this case had not its proper venue. and second, that the Albany judge who gave it first judicial sanction became the plaintiff's counsel, such sanction controlling absolutely at every subsequent stage except the second reversal. Next, we perceive that reversal was wrongfully deprived of its legitimate effect. Next, some extrinsic history may be proper. The Albany law firm, often alluded to, had much influence upon Democratic nominations. It had a mate in this respect on the other side. I have no doubt these dealers in party politics did in general earnestly oppose each other, but it is exceedingly probable that, in cases just like this, they mutually played into each other's hands. It is not to be overlooked that according to the ideas prevalent in 1857 and the amounts then and theretofore commonly involved in lawsuits, the claim in this case was a most temptingly large one. It had not entered into the minds of political jugglers at Albany to hope for such prodigious swindles as have since been perpetrated with impunity. The first two arguments of the second appeal were had in 1858. The Honorable Uriah Harris, often above alluded to, was one of the judges throughout that year. The court was equally divided. The vote on the argument in 1859 shows that Alexander S. Johnson and George F. Comstock were for the plaintiffs, the latter on the ground that the point was not appealable. Ante, p. 749. We have seen that it was about 1851 that the Albany Democratic law firm came into the case. 1859 was an unfortunate year for the plaintiffs. Mr. Hill, their leading counsel, died in it. Their second judgment was then reversed on the third argument. Ante, p. 741. By the autumn of 1860, they got ready for the new trial, with ex-Judge Cornelius L. Allen's letter denuding the reversal of its force and reinstating their case on the unreversed authority of Harris's opinion in Third Barber. That authority was enough to control Good J. at the circuit, and to control both him and his associates at the general term. Ante, 751-709. And here also by the force of authority, i.e., a precedent, Hon. W. B. Wright was enlisted for the plaintiffs. Ante, p. 709. His health was infirm, and for this and other causes he was not likely to review his own decision. The last appeal from it, as above stated, was not reached in the Court of Appeals until 1861, and then the plaintiffs, on the pretense above mentioned, got the case over to the next year, i.e., 1862. The course of things in that year 1862 is above narrated, but it is proper to state here that in the fall of 1861 the political managers on the anti-democratic side nominated Judge William B. Wright for the Court of Appeals, and the Democrats nominated for re-election Judge Comstock. The former was elected. The plaintiffs doubtless considered their work was done when Wright's nomination was secured, and cared little which of the candidates succeeded in the canvass. The result in 1862 was a division, the plaintiffs having Wright and Good J.J. committed to them by their own previous decisions founded on the Harris precedent, and W. F. Allen, the relative of precedent reversing next Judge Cornelius L. Allen, also voting that way. No more need be said. What happened in 1863 and 1864 is above stated. Judge H. N. Selden on the Republican side, and Judge W. F. Allen on the Democratic, were the nominees of the rival parties in the fall of 1862. Allen's opinion was known. I am persuaded Selden's was. In neither result the plaintiffs might count upon a vote. I strongly suspect that S. Johnson's ideas were in some way pumped from him before he was nominated in 1851. Just after the final disposition of this case it was current talk in Albany that it had controlled a whole series of nominations. Take its history throughout. I never knew of so much management and malversation in any other case. Its pendency covers a momentous period in the descent of our officials to the present political avernus. In it an apprenticeship was served by the rural plunderers of the metropolis. Dates may serve to show this. The advent of the Democratic firm at Albany into the case was in 1851. The Tweed system of government commenced in 1857 in company with a multitude of villainies. In that year the annual legislation first spread out to 2 volumes. At this period the plaintiffs had recovered, and the case was in the Court of Appeals. Ante, p. 131. Nominally adverse politicians then first began openly and shamelessly to play into each other's hands. The precise idea on which Judge H. N. Selden's opinion went finds an analogy in his views as counsel in the subsequent case of Miller v. Slate, 15 Wallace, prepared in 1874. Appendix B. The Democratic Platform in 1876. We, the delegates of the Democratic Party of the United States in National Convention assembled, do hereby declare the administration of the federal government to be in urgent need of immediate reform. Do hereby enjoin upon the nominees of this convention, and of the Democratic Party in each state, a zealous effort and cooperation to this end, and do hereby appeal to our fellow citizens of every former political connection, to undertake with us this first and most pressing patriotic duty. For the democracy of the whole country, we do here reaffirm our faith in the permanence of the Federal Union, our devotion to the Constitution of the United States, with its amendments universally accepted as a final settlement of the controversies that engendered civil war, and do here record our steadfast confidence in the perpetuity of Republican self-government. In absolute acquiescence in the will of the majority, the vital principle of republics. In the supremacy of the civil over the military authority. In the total separation of church and state, for the sake alike of civil and religious freedom. In the equality of all citizens before just laws of their own enactment. In the liberty of individual conduct, unmixed by sumptuary laws. In the faithful education of the rising generation, that they may preserve, enjoy, and transmit these best conditions of human happiness and hope. We behold the noblest products of 100 years of changeful history. But, while upholding the bond of our Union and great charter of these our rights, it behooves a free people to practice also that eternal vigilance which is the price of liberty. Reform is necessary to rebuild and establish in the hearts of the whole people, the Union, 11 years ago happily rescued from the danger of a secession of states, but now to be saved from a corrupt centralism, which, after inflicting upon 10 states the rapacity of carpet-bag tyrannies, has honeycombed the offices of the federal government itself with incapacity, waste, and fraud, infected states and municipalities with the contagion of misrule, and locked fast the prosperity of an industrious people in the paralysis of hard times. Reform is necessary to establish a sound currency, restore the public credit, and maintain the national honor. We denounce the failure for all these 11 years of peace to make good the promise of the legal tender notes, which are a changing standard of value in the hands of the people, and the non-payment of which is a disregard of the plighted faith of the nation. We denounce the improvidence which, in 11 years of peace, has taken from the people, in federal taxes, 13 times the whole amount of the legal tender notes, and squandered 4 times their sum in useless expense, without accumulating any reserve for their redemption. We denounce the financial imbecility and immorality of that party which, during 11 years of peace, has made no advance towards resumption, no preparation for resumption, but instead has obstructed resumption by wasting our resources and exhausting all our surplus income, and, while annually professing to intend a speedy return to specie payments, has annually enacted fresh hindrances thereto. As such a hindrance, we denounce the resumption clause of the Act of 1875 and demand its repeal. We demand a judicious system of preparation by public economies, by official retrenchments, and by wise finance, which shall enable the nation soon to assure the whole world of its perfect ability and its perfect readiness to meet any of its promises at the call of the creditor entitled to payment. We believe such a system, well devised, and, above all, entrusted to competent hands for execution, creating at no time an artificial scarcity of currency, and at no time alarming the public mind into a withdrawal of that vaster machinery of credit by which 95% of all business transactions are performed. A system open, public, and inspiring general confidence would from the day of its adoption bring healing on its wings to all our harassed industries, set in motion the wheels of commerce, manufactures, and the mechanic arts, restore employment to labor, and renew in all its natural sources the prosperity of the people. Reform is necessary in the sum and modes of federal taxation, to the end that capital may be set free from distrust and labor lightly burdened. We denounce the present tariff, levied upon nearly 4,000 articles, as a masterpiece of injustice, inequality, and false prudence. It yields a dwindling, not a yearly rising, revenue. It has impoverished many industries to subsidize a few. It prohibits imports that might purchase the products of American labor. It has degraded American commerce from the first to an inferior rank on the high seas. It has cut down the sales of American manufactures at home and abroad, and depleted the returns of American agriculture and industry, followed by half our people. It costs the people 5 times more than it produces to the Treasury, obstructs the processes of production, and wastes the fruits of labor. It promotes fraud, fosters smuggling, enriches dishonest officials, and bankrupts honest merchants. We demand that all custom house taxation shall be only for revenue. Reform is necessary in the scale of public expense, federal, state, and municipal. Our federal taxation has swollen from 60 millions gold in 1860 to 450 millions currency in 1870. Our aggregate taxation from 154 millions gold in 1860 to 730 millions currency in 1870, or in 1 decade from less than $5 per head to more than $18 per head. Since the peace, the people have paid to their tax gatherers more than thrice the sum of the national debt, and more than twice that sum for the federal government alone. We demand a rigorous frugality in every department, and from every officer of the government. Reform is necessary to put a stop to the profligate waste of public lands and their diversion from actual settlers by the party in power, which has squandered 200 millions of acres upon railroads alone, and out of more than thrice that aggregate has disposed of less than 1/6 directly to tillers of the soil. Reform is necessary to correct the omissions of a Republican Congress and the errors of our treaties and our diplomacy, which have stripped our fellow citizens of foreign birth and kindred race recrossing the Atlantic of the shield of American citizenship, and have exposed our brethren of the Pacific coast to the incursions of a race not sprung from the same great parent stock, and in fact now by law denied citizenship through naturalization, as being neither accustomed to the traditions of a progressive civilization nor exercised in liberty under equal laws. We denounce the policy which thus discards the liberty-loving German and tolerates the revival of the coolie trade in Mongolian women imported for immoral purposes, and Mongolian men hired to perform servile labor contracts, and demand such a modification of the treaty with the Chinese Empire, or such legislation by Congress within constitutional limitations, as shall prevent the further importation or immigration of the Mongolian race. Reform is necessary and can never be effected but by making it the controlling issue of the elections, and lifting it above the 2 false issues with which the office-holding class and the party in power seek to smother it. 1. The false issue with which they would enkindle sectarian strife in respect to the public schools, of which the establishment and support belong exclusively to the several states, and which the Democratic Party has cherished from their foundation, and is resolved to maintain without prejudice or preference for any class, sect, or creed, and without contributions from the Treasury to any. 2. The false issue by which they seek to light anew the dying embers of sectional hate between kindred peoples once estranged, but now reunited in one indivisible republic and a common destiny. Reform is necessary in the civil service. Experience proves that efficient, economical conduct of the governmental business is not possible if its civil service be subject to change at every election, be a prize fought for at the ballot box, be a brief reward of party zeal, instead of posts of honor assigned for proved competency, and held for fidelity in the public employ, that the dispensing of patronage should neither be a tax upon the time of all our public men, nor the instrument of their ambition. Here again promises falsified in the performance attest that the party in power can work out no practical or salutary reform. Reform is necessary even more in the higher grades of the public service. President, Vice President, judges, senators, representatives, cabinet officers, these and all others in authority are the people's servants. Their offices are not a private perquisite. They are a public trust. When the annals of this republic show the disgrace and censure of a vice president, a late Speaker of the House of Representatives marketing his rulings as a presiding officer, 3 senators profiting secretly by their votes as lawmakers, 5 chairmen of the leading committees of the late House of Representatives exposed in jobbery, a late Secretary of the Treasury forcing balances in the public accounts, a late Attorney General misappropriating public funds, a Secretary of the Navy enriched or enriching friends by percentages levied off the profits of contractors with his department, a minister to England censured in a dishonorable speculation, the President's private secretary barely escaping conviction upon trial for guilty complicity in frauds upon the revenue, a Secretary of War impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. The demonstration is complete that the first step in reform must be the people's choice of honest men from another party, lest the disease of one political organization infect the body politic, and lest by making no change of men or parties we get no change of measures and no real reform. All the abuses, wrongs, and crimes, the product of 16 years' ascendancy of the Republican Party, create a necessity for reform confessed by Republicans themselves, but their reformers are voted down in convention and displaced from the cabinet. The party's mass of honest voters is powerless to resist the 80,000 office holders, its leaders and guides. Reform can only be had by a peaceful civil revolution. We demand a change of system, a change of administration, a change of parties, that we may have a change of measures and of men. John Bigelow's career is one to be greatly admired throughout his lifetime. He was a highly respected statesman, attorney, American consul in Paris, chargé d'affaires, just to name few of his many accomplishments over his lifetime. Visit his bio page on Wiki and a search on archive.org to review his registered works. I am humbled and honored to have found both Mr. Tilden and John Bigelow's history, which leaves me to wonder, where are the great statesmen of the 20th and 21st century fighting for the American people and more than their own back pockets?